My name is Dr. Daniel Cross, and I spent 17 years as a behavioral psychologist working with the Department of Defense on classified programs that most Americans don't even know exist. My specialty was developing communication protocols for situations involving non-human intelligence, essentially figuring out how to establish meaningful dialogue with entities whose cognitive architecture might be fundamentally different from ours. For most of my career, this was theoretical work, preparing for possibilities that seemed remote and hypothetical. Then in 2018, I was brought into a program called Threshold that changed everything I thought I understood about consciousness, reality, and what happens when we die. I was given access to 3 extraterrestrial beings who had been in government custody for varying lengths of time, and over 18 months of careful interaction, these beings told me things about the nature of existence that aligned disturbingly well with ancient religious teachings about heaven and hell, though not in the ways those concepts are typically understood. The facility where Threshold operated was buried deep beneath Groom Lake, what the public knows as Area 51, in a section that required security clearances beyond top secret and psychological evaluations so thorough they felt invasive. Getting to the containment level required passing through 7 separate checkpoints, biometric verification at each one, and a final medical scan that apparently checked for everything from neural implants to chemical alterations that might indicate you'd been compromised. The atmosphere down there was different from any military or research facility I'd worked in before, hushed and heavy, with personnel speaking in quiet tones and avoiding eye contact like they were all carrying secrets that weighed on them visibly. I learned quickly that everyone at Threshold had experienced things that changed them fundamentally, encounters with intelligence so alien that it forced complete reevaluation of assumptions about consciousness and existence that most humans never question. The 3 beings in custody were designated Subject Alpha, Subject Beta, and Subject Gamma, cold bureaucratic labels for entities that were startlingly individual and distinct once you spent time with them. Alpha had been recovered from a crash site in Arizona in 1953 and had been in containment for 65 years, longer than I had been alive. Beta was retrieved from the ocean off the coast of Japan in 1997, following reports of lights descending into the water. Gamma was the most recent acquisition, taken into custody after what the official records described as voluntary surrender in New Mexico in 2016. All 3 were humanoid in basic structure, but clearly not human, with physiology that suggested evolution under different conditions, different gravity, different atmospheric composition. But what made them truly alien wasn't their physical form, it was the way they thought, the way they perceived reality, the way they described existence in terms that had more in common with mysticism than science. My initial sessions with Alpha were frustrating because the beings seemed completely uninterested in discussing technology, biology, or their home planet, the topics that previous researchers had focused on for decades. Instead, Alpha kept trying to steer conversations toward questions about human consciousness, what we believed happened after death, whether we understood the nature of what we called the soul. At first, I dismissed this as deflection or possibly some kind of intelligence gathering about human psychology, but as weeks passed and Alpha demonstrated increasing frustration with my materialist framework, I began to realize the being was trying to communicate something it considered fundamentally important that I simply wasn't equipped to understand. Alpha finally asked me directly during one session if I had ever experienced what humans called a near-death experience or mystical revelation. When I said no, that I was a scientist who dealt with observable phenomena, not supernatural speculation, Alpha made a sound that the translator program interpreted as profound sadness mixed with frustration. What Alpha explained over the following months, with patience that seemed almost infinite, was that human science had developed sophisticated understanding of the physical universe, but remained almost completely ignorant about consciousness and its relationship to reality. We had mapped atoms and galaxies, but didn't understand the aware space in which that mapping occurred. We studied neural correlates of consciousness, but missed the fundamental truth that consciousness wasn't produced by brains, but rather brains were receivers and filters for consciousness that existed independent of physical substrate. Alpha's species, along with numerous other civilizations scattered across what they called the manifold of inhabited worlds, had long ago made the discovery that physical reality was actually a subset of a larger consciousness-based reality, and that what humans thought of as life and death were actually just transitions between different states of conscious existence. This sounded like metaphysics or religion rather than information from an advanced extraterrestrial species, and I said as much. Alpha responded by asking me what I thought happened to consciousness when the brain stopped functioning. I gave the standard materialist answer, that consciousness was an emergent property of neural activity and therefore ceased when that activity stopped. Alpha made that sad sound again and asked if I'd ever wondered why near-death experiences across all human cultures reported similar phenomena: out-of-body perception, movement through darkness toward light, encounters with deceased loved ones, life review, feelings of profound peace. Was it just coincidental that human consciousness, supposedly a random byproduct of evolution, would generate such consistent hallucinations at the moment of death? Or was it more logical to consider that these weren't hallucinations at all, but actual perceptions of transitional states between physical and non-physical existence? I spent hours arguing with Alpha about this, bringing up neurochemical explanations for NDE phenomena, citing studies on oxygen deprivation and temporal lobe stimulation, defending the materialist position I'd built my career on. Alpha listened patiently to everything, never interrupting, then asked a simple question that I couldn't adequately answer. If consciousness was just brain activity, just neurons firing in particular patterns, then how could people with no measurable brain activity during cardiac arrest report verifiable perception of events happening around their physical body and even in other rooms? How could consciousness continue to process information and form memories when the brain was clinically dead? The standard explanations about hallucinations formed during recovery didn't account for verified perception of specific details that the person couldn't have known through any normal sensory input. Alpha suggested that maybe the simpler explanation was the correct one, that consciousness could exist independent of the brain and simply used the brain as an interface with physical reality. Beta, when I began sessions with that being, approached the same topics from a different angle. Beta had spent less time in custody and seemed more willing to directly share what their species understood about post-death existence. Beta explained that advanced civilizations throughout the cosmos had developed technologies and practices for maintaining continuity of consciousness across multiple physical lifetimes, essentially solving what humans feared as death by ensuring that the individual awareness, the core sense of self, persisted and reincarnated deliberately rather than randomly or not at all. Their understanding was that consciousness was fundamental and eternal, with physical existence being temporary experiences that consciousness chose to have for purposes of growth and learning. What humans called heaven wasn't a place you went to after death, but rather a state of consciousness you returned to between physical lifetimes, a realm of awareness where the limitations and suffering of physical existence fell away, and you remembered your true nature as eternal consciousness. I asked Beta to describe this state more concretely, to give me something beyond vague spiritual language that could mean anything. Beta closed their large, dark eyes for a long moment, then began describing what they called the consensus realm, the native state of consciousness when not incarnated in physical form. In this state, awareness was not localized to a single point of view, but rather experienced reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously.
You were still yourself, still retained the unique pattern of consciousness that was your individual identity, but you also experienced yourself as part of a larger unified consciousness, like a wave that knows it's both wave and ocean simultaneously. In this state, communication wasn't through language, but through direct transmission of meaning, with full understanding passing between consciousnesses instantly, without the distortion and limitations of words. Time didn't flow linearly, but rather all moments existed simultaneously accessible, with past and future being more like different locations you could visit rather than constraints you were trapped within. Most significantly, Beta described what they called the review process that every consciousness underwent between physical lifetimes, examining the life just completed from every perspective involved. You experienced not just your own feelings and thoughts during significant moments, but also the feelings and thoughts of everyone you interacted with, understanding how your actions affected others from their direct experience. This was what some human near-death experiencers described as life review, but Beta explained it was far more profound than most humans understood. You experienced the joy you brought others and the pain you caused others, not as abstract knowledge, but as direct felt experience, feeling exactly what they felt in those moments. This wasn't judgment from an external divine authority, but rather natural consequence of consciousness examining itself, and Beta said it was far more intense and transformative than any human religious concept of judgment by a deity. If you've ever wondered what lies beyond death or questioned materialism's answers, share your thoughts in the comments. I asked Beta what happened to consciousness that caused severe harm to others during physical life, how that was addressed in this consensus realm they described. Beta's response was disturbing in its implications. They explained that consciousness that had caused significant suffering experienced that suffering directly and completely during the review process, feeling the full weight of every pain they inflicted from the victim's perspective. For consciousness that had caused extreme harm, perhaps murder or torture or systematic cruelty, this review could be so intense and agonizing that the consciousness would essentially fracture or retreat into isolation, unable to integrate the experience of the suffering it had caused. This isolated, fragmented state was what human religions had intuited as hell, not a place of external punishment, but rather a state of consciousness trapped in its own guilt and horror, separated from the unified field of consciousness that Beta called home or heaven. Eventually, through a process Beta compared to healing or therapy, but occurring across what humans would measure as centuries, these fragmented consciousnesses could be helped to integrate their experiences and rejoin the unified field. Nothing was eternal except consciousness itself. Even hell was temporary, but the suffering was real and self-imposed through the natural mechanics of consciousness examining itself. Gamma provided the most detailed and disturbing information about what their species understood about consciousness and post-death existence. Gamma explained that physical reality, everything we perceived as the material universe, was actually a kind of training ground or school where consciousness chose to incarnate for specific learning experiences. Physical existence had constraints and limitations that the consensus realm didn't have: separation between individuals, linear time, limited perception, suffering, and death, and these constraints created opportunities for certain types of growth and development that weren't possible in the native state of consciousness. Earth specifically had been designated as what Gamma called an intensive development realm, meaning the level of difficulty and suffering here was significantly higher than most inhabited worlds. Consciousness that chose to incarnate on Earth was either very brave, very ambitious, or making some kind of remediation for previous actions that required intense learning experiences.
Gamma described something that made my blood run cold when I first heard it. They said that before incarnating into physical form, consciousness in the consensus realm could perceive probability streams, potential futures branching from current moments, and could see roughly what kind of life they were choosing to experience.
Every consciousness that incarnated on Earth had, in this view, essentially chosen the life they would live, including the suffering and challenges they would face, because those experiences offered learning or growth that consciousness deemed valuable. This wasn't to say that suffering was good or that victims were somehow responsible for their victimization, but rather that from the perspective of eternal consciousness choosing temporary physical experience, even suffering had meaning and purpose within the larger arc of consciousness evolution across multiple lifetimes. I struggled with this concept intensely because it seemed to justify every evil and suffering in human history as somehow chosen or deserved. Gamma sensed my distress and tried to clarify. They explained that from within physical existence, with our limited perception and identification with physical body, suffering was absolutely real and should be prevented and alleviated whenever possible. But from the perspective of eternal consciousness examining physical existence from outside it, suffering was temporary experience that consciousness chose to have for complex reasons we couldn't fully understand while identified with physical form. The comparison Gamma used was that while experiencing a nightmare, the terror and suffering feel completely real, but when you wake up, you understand it was experience occurring in consciousness rather than external reality. Physical existence, including Earth with all its suffering and evil, was somewhat similar, terribly real while you were in it, but understood differently from the perspective of consciousness that existed before birth and continued after death. I asked Gamma what the purpose was. Why would infinite eternal consciousness choose to fragment itself into limited physical forms that suffered and struggled and often forgot their true nature entirely? Gamma's response was that consciousness, by its nature, sought to know itself through experience, to explore every possible way of being and perceiving. Unified consciousness was complete and perfect, but also changeless and without the contrast that allowed for appreciation and growth. Physical existence, with its limitations and dualities, provided that contrast. Joy meant more having experienced suffering. Love meant more having experienced separation. Consciousness meant more having experienced unconsciousness. Every physical lifetime added to the total self-knowledge of consciousness, expanding the infinite in ways that even Gamma's advanced species didn't fully understand, but had come to accept as fundamental to the nature of existence itself. Over the following months, I had hundreds of hours of conversation with all three beings, and despite their different personalities and perspectives, they all described essentially the same model of consciousness and existence. They all confirmed that what humans called heaven and hell were real, but not as places or external realms where you went after death. Heaven was the return to unified consciousness, experiencing yourself as part of the infinite while retaining individual perspective, a state of such profound peace and joy and understanding that physical existence seemed like a brief, difficult dream by comparison. Hell was the state of consciousness so damaged by actions taken during physical life, so fragmented by guilt and horror at suffering caused, that it couldn't integrate back into unified consciousness and instead existed in isolation, reliving its own worst moments until healing could occur. And physical existence was the temporary state in between, consciousness deliberately limiting itself to have specific experiences that served larger purposes we couldn't perceive from our limited perspective.
I asked why, if all this was true, didn't extraterrestrial species share this knowledge with humanity openly instead of remaining hidden and allowing us to struggle in ignorance? The answer from all three beings was essentially the same. Consciousness had to discover these truths through its own experience and development, not have them imposed from outside. Being told that you were eternal consciousness, having a temporary physical experience, wouldn't transform you if you hadn't lived through experiences that made that truth meaningful. It would just be more abstract belief, another religious doctrine that didn't penetrate to direct understanding. Humanity as a species was still in early stages of development, still strongly identified with physical form, still operating primarily from ego consciousness that saw itself as separate from others and from the whole. Eventually, as individuals had experiences that expanded their consciousness beyond ego identification, and as our species developed technologies and practices for exploring consciousness directly, we would come to understand what these extraterrestrial civilizations already knew. But it had to be our own discovery, our own awakening, not information simply handed to us. What disturbed me most about these conversations was how closely what the beings described matched reports from human near-death experiences, mystical experiences, and the esoteric teachings of various spiritual traditions. People who had been clinically dead and resuscitated often reported similar phenomena: out-of-body perception, movement through darkness toward brilliant light, encounters with deceased loved ones and beings of light, life review where they experienced their impact on others directly, feelings of profound love and peace, and reluctance to return to physical body. These experiencers consistently reported that the experience was more real than normal waking life, not dreamlike or hallucinatory, but hyper-real in ways that normal consciousness couldn't match. They often came back transformed, losing fear of death, becoming more compassionate and less materialistic, saying that consciousness was eternal and that physical life was temporary experience within it. Similarly, mystics and spiritual practitioners across all human traditions who achieved deep meditative states or spontaneous spiritual awakening described experiences that aligned with what the beings told me. They reported experiencing themselves as consciousness beyond physical form, feeling unity with all existence while maintaining individual awareness, accessing knowledge that seemed to come from beyond their personal mind, and understanding that what they called soul or spirit or true self was eternal and indestructible, while the physical body was temporary vehicle. These weren't ignorant, primitive people, but often highly educated individuals, including scientists and philosophers, who had experiences that convinced them consciousness was fundamental rather than emergent, and that physical death was transformation rather than annihilation. The implications of all this, if true, were staggering. It meant that materialist science, for all its success at understanding physical mechanisms, had completely missed the most important aspect of reality, that consciousness was primary and matter was derivative rather than vice versa. It meant that human religions, despite their many corruptions and dogmatic distortions, were pointing at real truths about the nature of consciousness and post-death existence, just using metaphorical and culturally specific language that obscured as much as it revealed. It meant that death wasn't the end, that the people we loved and lost still existed as consciousness, even if no longer in physical form. It meant that actions in this life had real consequences, not through divine punishment, but through the natural mechanics of consciousness reviewing itself between incarnations. And it meant that the suffering and evil in the world, while absolutely real and requiring our compassionate response, existed within a larger context of consciousness choosing experience for purposes we couldn't fully grasp from our limited perspective.
I spent months after those initial conversations trying to verify or falsify what the beings had told me. I read extensively in near-death experience research, finding study after study documenting cases where people with no measurable brain activity reported verifiable perceptions of events occurring around and away from their physical body. I studied the cross-cultural consistency of mystical experiences, how practitioners of completely different traditions using completely different methods reported remarkably similar experiences of consciousness beyond ego. I examined the latest research in quantum mechanics and consciousness studies, finding that some physicists were beginning to suspect that consciousness might be fundamental rather than emergent, that the observer wasn't separate from observed reality, but somehow intrinsic to it. Everything I found supported rather than contradicted what the beings had told me, which was itself disturbing because it meant my entire worldview had been incomplete, if not outright wrong. The breaking point came when I had what could only be described as a direct experience during a meditation session I'd begun practicing based on techniques Beta had described. I was sitting in my apartment trying to quiet my analytical mind and simply observe consciousness itself, when I suddenly felt my awareness expand beyond the normal boundaries of self. For a brief moment, maybe only seconds by external measurement, I experienced myself as consciousness observing Daniel Cross rather than being Daniel Cross. I felt that there was awareness present that was experiencing being me, but wasn't limited to or defined by me, like an actor so immersed in a role they temporarily forget they're acting, but still having that actor awareness present beneath the character. And in that moment, I understood viscerally what the beings had been trying to communicate, that I wasn't a physical body that somehow produced consciousness, but rather consciousness having the temporary experience of being a physical body, and that when this body died, the consciousness that was aware of these words right now wouldn't cease, but would simply transition to a different state of existence. The experience lasted only moments before my analytical mind rushed back in and my awareness contracted to its normal ego boundaries. But those moments were enough to fundamentally change how I understood myself and reality. I couldn't go back to believing that consciousness was just neurons firing, couldn't accept that the awareness reading these thoughts right now was nothing but chemical reactions that would simply stop at death. I had directly experienced, however briefly, that awareness existed beyond the physical form, and that experience was more convincing than any amount of philosophical argument or scientific data could be. I finally understood why the beings had seemed almost sad when interacting with materialist-identified humans. They were watching consciousness that had forgotten its true nature, trapped in identification with temporary physical form and terrified of death that was actually just transition to a more expansive state of being. Share your thoughts on consciousness and what you think happens after death, especially if you've had experiences that challenged materialist explanations. I continued working with the three beings for another year, learning more about their understanding of consciousness, reality, and the structure of existence. They described what they called densities or levels of consciousness, with physical existence being the densest and most limited, and progressively higher levels being less material and more purely consciousness-based until you reached the unified field that was pure awareness without form. They explained that what humans called angels or spiritual guides were often consciousness at these higher densities that had chosen to help physical beings navigate their challenging incarnations. They confirmed that communication with deceased loved ones was possible because consciousness didn't cease at physical death, though they cautioned that such communication was often distorted by our expectations and psychological needs. They described reincarnation as real, but not mechanical or guaranteed, with consciousness having choice about whether and where to incarnate again based on what experiences they wanted to have or what learning they still sought.
But they also emphasized that none of this should distract from the importance of physical existence while we're in it. Even if death was just transition and consciousness was eternal, our actions here mattered enormously. The suffering we caused others would be experienced directly during review. The love and kindness we offered would also be experienced and appreciated. The growth and learning we achieved would be integrated into our broader consciousness. Physical existence, for all its limitations and suffering, was precious opportunity that consciousness chose specifically because of those challenges.
The goal wasn't to escape physical life or devalue it, but rather to live it more fully while understanding its place within the larger context of eternal consciousness exploring itself through infinite forms and experiences. The Threshold program was shut down in late 2019 for reasons that were never fully explained to me. The 3 beings were transferred to other facilities I wasn't cleared to know about, and all personnel were scattered to different assignments with strict non-disclosure agreements and psychological monitoring to ensure we didn't share what we'd learned. I was offered continued government employment in conventional psychological research, but I declined and took early retirement instead. I couldn't go back to treating consciousness as nothing but brain activity, couldn't pretend that death was the end and physical existence was all that mattered. I had been changed too fundamentally by what I experienced and learned, and I needed time away from government control to process it all and decide what to do with the knowledge. I'm sharing this now, 3 years after my discharge, because I believe humanity deserves to know what captured extraterrestrial beings have told us about consciousness and existence. We're not just biological machines that cease at death. We're eternal consciousness having temporary physical experiences, and what we do during those experiences matters more than most people realize because we will review them from every perspective and integrate them into our broader awareness. Heaven and hell are real, but not as places where an external God sends us. They're states of consciousness we experience based on how we've lived and what we've become through our choices. And physical existence, with all its suffering and challenges, is something we chose before birth because of learning opportunities it offers that can't be had any other way. I don't expect everyone to believe what I'm sharing. It sounds insane from a conventional materialist perspective, and I have no physical proof I can offer without violating security protocols that would land me in prison. But I'm not writing this to convince skeptics. I'm writing for those who already sense that there's more to existence than material science explains, who have had experiences that suggested consciousness doesn't cease at death, who feel deep down that we're spiritual beings having physical experience rather than physical beings randomly developing spiritual feelings. You're right. Your intuition is correct, and the beings we've captured, the ones who come from civilizations millions of years older than ours, confirm what mystics and near-death experiencers and spiritual practitioners have been saying for millennia. Consciousness is eternal. Death is transition, and how we live matters not because of divine judgment, but because of the natural consequences of consciousness reviewing itself and experiencing all perspectives it touched during physical existence. What captured aliens spoke about heaven and hell wasn't the mythology of rewards and punishments taught in churches. It was the natural mechanics of consciousness that exists beyond physical death, the states we experience between incarnations, and the review process where we face ourselves completely. I wasn't ready for what they described because it meant everything I'd built my worldview on was incomplete. But now that I know, now that I've experienced glimpses of consciousness beyond ego, I can't pretend the materialist story is sufficient. We're so much more than we've been taught to believe, and death, the thing we fear most, is actually just going home.